Rain swept across the Montana Valley so hard it looked like the sky itself had cracked open. The wind pushed cold sheets of water across the open land, bending the tall grass flat against the mud. Silas Carter rode slowly through the storm, with his hat pulled low over his brow. The rain blurred everything around him, and even his horse struggled to see the trail ahead. Silas had lived in Montana long enough to know storms like this one. They came fast and left just as quickly. Most men stayed inside when the clouds turned this dark. But Silas had spent years alone on the land, and bad weather no longer frightened him. Loneliness had been his closest companion for far longer than any storm. Still, even he had never expected to see what appeared beside the road that afternoon. At first, he thought it was a bundle of cloth lying in the mud, something the wind had torn loose from a wagon. But as his horse moved closer, the shape shifted. It was a woman. She sat half-collapsed beside the road, her thin body shaking against the cold rain. Her dress clung to her skin, soaked through and streaked with mud. The hem had torn in several places, and the leather of her shoes had worn away so badly that the skin of her feet showed through. Silas slowed his horse and stared down at her. She held a small valise against her chest with both hands, like it was the last thing she owned in the world. Her arms wrapped around it tightly, as if someone might try to steal it from her. When she lifted her head, Silas saw her eyes. They were brown, but the skin around them was red and hollow from exhaustion, and they were the eyes of someone who had traveled too far with no place left to go. Silas cleared his throat. His voice came out rough from disuse. "Where you headed?" The woman blinked through the rain. For a moment it seemed like she might not answer. Then she said quietly, "I don't know anymore." The words hit him harder than the storm. Silas looked down the road behind her. The nearest town sat 5 muddy miles away. His small cabin was only 1 mile in the other direction. He looked back at her again. The woman shivered violently, her thin shoulders trembling beneath the soaked fabric of her dress. Rain dripped from her hair and ran down her face like silent tears. Something stirred inside Silas then. Something old and buried deep beneath years of quiet living and careful distance from other people. He sighed softly, but then he leaned down and held out his hand. "Come on." For a moment she simply stared at him, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Then slowly she reached up. Her fingers were freezing cold when they touched his. Silas pulled her carefully onto the back of his horse and turned toward his cabin. The woman leaned against him as the horse began walking through the storm again. Her body trembled with every step. They rode in silence. Sometimes kindness arrives when a person has nothing left to hold on to. It does not arrive with loud promises or grand speeches. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wearing a worn hat and speaking only a few simple words. By the time they reached the cabin, the rain had slowed, but the wind still howled across the valley. Silas pushed open the door and helped the woman inside. The place smelled faintly of wood smoke and long neglect. Dishes sat in a basin beside the sink with dried beans clinging to the edges. Dust covered the windows so thick it looked like frost. Silas had lived alone long enough that he barely noticed the mess anymore. He moved straight to the stove and knelt beside it, feeding dry kindling into the iron belly until the flames began to catch. Behind him, the woman stood dripping onto the wooden floor, hugging herself tightly for warmth while still clutching the valise against her ribs. Silas stood and grabbed a thick wool blanket from the back of a chair. Without looking directly at her face, he held it out. "Get warm." She took it slowly. Her cold fingers brushed his hand for only a second. Silas poured black coffee into a tin cup and set it near the fire. The woman sat down carefully and wrapped both hands around it. Only then did he see how badly they trembled. She had not eaten properly in days. Anyone with eyes could see that. Silas sat across from her, while steam slowly rose from her drying clothes. The cabin filled with the smell of wet wool and wood smoke. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, the woman whispered a single word. Ohio. Silas lifted his eyes. My parents died when I was 17, she continued quietly. Scarlet fever took them both in the same week. Silas gave a small nod. Loss was a language he understood well. I worked in a sewing factory after that, she said. 12 hours every day. Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. Then I saw the advertisement. Silas waited. A Montana rancher looking for a wife, hard-working and sincere. Her voice stayed steady, but it sounded like she was telling a story about someone else. We wrote letters for 3 months. She swallowed slowly. He promised he would meet me at the Willow Creek Depot. Said he would wear a blue kerchief so I could recognize him. Her eyes lowered to the floor. I sold everything I owned for a train ticket. Silas did not interrupt. I waited 2 days at the station, she said, slept on a wooden bench, but he never came. The fire cracked quietly in the stove. So I started walking. She looked down at her hands. 40 miles. Silas felt something tighten in his chest. 3 days, she finished. She reached down and opened the valise. Inside sat a bundle of letters, tied carefully with a piece of kitchen string. The paper had softened from the rain, and the ink had begun to smear. She handed them to him. His name was James Hollister, she said. Silas froze. James Hollister ran the general store in Willow Creek. He also had a wife, and the 2 children, and he had never owned a ranch in his life. Silas slowly looked back at her. You know him, the woman said quietly. Silas nodded once. He's got a family. The words hung heavy in the small cabin. For a moment the woman did not move. Then she stood, without anger, without tears. She walked calmly to the stove. One by one, she fed the letters into the fire. The ink curled and blackened as the flames consumed them. 3 months of hope burned away in seconds. Wet when the last piece turned to ash, Silas spoke. You can stay here, he said, as long as you need. The woman did not answer. She only watched the fire until the last letter disappeared. Her name, Silas would soon learn, was Faith. Faith slept through most of the next day. Silas checked on her twice, but never woke her. She lay curled beneath the thick wool blanket on the narrow bed in the spare room, breathing deep and steady. The exhaustion of 40 hard miles through open country had finally claimed its price. Her body needed rest more than anything else. Silas stepped quietly away each time he looked in. The cabin stayed silent for most of that day. Outside, the rain faded and the clouds slowly drifted away from the valley. By evening, the sky turned clear again, leaving the land washed clean and quiet. When morning came, Silas woke to something he had not smelled in years: cornbread. The scent drifted through the cabin warm and comforting, filling every corner of the small house. Silas sat up slowly, confused for a moment. Then he heard the soft sound of pans moving against the stove. He walked into the front room and stopped in the doorway. Faith stood by the stove, with her hair pinned neatly back and an old apron tied around her waist. The sleeves of her dress were rolled to her elbows as she carefully lifted a cast-iron skillet from the heat. The table had been wiped clean. The basin was empty. Every dish had been washed and stacked neatly on the shelf. For the first time in years, the cabin looked like someone truly lived there. Faith glanced back over her shoulder. I don't take charity, she said calmly. I work for my keep. Silas pulled out a chair and sat at the table without answering. She placed a thick piece of cornbread in front of him. It tasted like something he had not known for a very long time. Home. The days that followed passed quietly. Faith worked from morning until evening with calm determination. She scrubbed the floors and wiped dust from the windows. She mended shirts that Silas had forgotten he owned. She repaired a loose board near the door and patched a tear in one of the blankets. Silas watched her sometimes from the doorway or from the yard. She moved with purpose, but never wasted motion. Still, something behind her eyes remained closed off, and a quiet sadness lived there, hidden deep where no one else could reach. 10 days passed before she asked him for anything. They were sitting at the table eating breakfast when she finally spoke. "Mr. Silas?" He looked up from his coffee. "Yes?" She hesitated only a moment. "May I plant some flowers beside the porch?" The question caught him off guard. No one had asked him for something so small in years. He shrugged lightly. "Plant whatever you want." That afternoon, Silas worked near the fence while Faith knelt in the dirt beside the porch steps. She used an old hand spade to dig small holes carefully along the edge of the boards. The morning sun caught her hair, turning it soft bronze as she worked. She hummed quietly while she planted each seed. Silas told himself he was fixing the fence. He told himself he was not watching her. But when she glanced up suddenly and caught him staring, he nearly struck the fence post with his hammer. Faith smiled just a little. Only the corner of her mouth moved, but it was enough to show that she knew. That evening, she did something else different. She placed her small valise in the corner of the room and left it there. For the first time since arriving, she did not keep it beside her feet. She did not carry it from place to place. She simply left it resting quietly against the wall. "I'm tired of carrying it," she said softly. Silas understood more than the words themselves. Some burdens did not need to be explained. 7 days later, they rode into town together. Faith wanted to send a letter to a friend back in Ohio to tell her she was safe. But Silas could sense the tension in her even before the town came into view. Her hands twisted a handkerchief again and again until the cloth looked like rope. Her shoulders were stiff with worry. "Nobody's going to bite you," Silas said gently. Faith tried to smile, but it did not reach her eyes. Willow Creek appeared slowly over the rise. The church steeple stood tall near the center of town. The general store sat beside the dirt road, with 2 wagons parked outside. A few horses were tied along the wooden rail. People moved along the boardwalk in small groups. Silas felt Faith stiffen slightly behind him on the horse. When they stepped inside the general store, the bell above the door rang softly. 3 women turned at the sound. Their voices stopped at once. Every pair of eyes settled on Faith. Silas felt the heat climb slowly up his neck. He had known this might happen. Martha Perkins stood behind the counter. Her smile looked sweet, but her eyes were sharp. "Well now," she said slowly. "Silas Carter. Been a while." Her gaze slid toward Faith. "And who might this be?" "She's helping out at my place," Silas answered. "Helping," Martha repeated carefully. Faith met her stare calmly. "Good morning, ma'am," she said politely. Martha blinked, slightly thrown by the quiet confidence in Faith's voice. "Good morning." Faith stepped forward and mailed her letter. But the whispering began before they even reached the door. The women spoke behind their hands, their eyes never leaving Faith. Silas felt every second of it. When they stepped outside onto the boardwalk again, the voices drifted through the open window behind them. "Mail order bride," Martha whispered. "Left at the depot like unwanted baggage." Another voice joined in. "And now living with Silas Carter alone." Low laughter followed. Faith's shoulders tightened, but she kept walking. She did not turn around. She did not answer them. The ride home was silent. Dust rose behind the horse as they crossed the open valley. Faith stared straight ahead. "They think I'm a fallen woman," she said finally. Her voice did not tremble. "I know what they think." She looked at Silas. "But it doesn't change the truth." Something in her gaze softened slightly. "Thank you," she said quietly, "but for letting me stand my ground." Life settled into a fragile calm again. Faith cooked meals each evening that filled the cabin with warmth. She watered the small flowers growing beside the porch and kept the house clean and bright. Slowly, the place began to feel alive. But trouble had already begun moving toward them. 7 days after the trip to town, a rider appeared on the road. It was Wilbur, the mail carrier. He rarely stopped at Silas's cabin. That alone was enough to make Silas uneasy. Wilbur climbed down from his horse slowly and glanced toward Faith, standing quietly on the porch. "Bank got robbed last night," he said. Silas frowned. "Willow Creek Bank. Safe cleaned out." Faith stood very still. Wilbur cleared his throat. "Sheriff's asking questions. Anyone who passed through town recently?" His eyes flicked toward Faith again. Silas felt his hands tighten. Later that same day, Silas rode into town to buy medicine for one of his horses. Inside the saloon, Pete Tucker pulled him aside. "I'm telling you this because your daddy once helped mine," Pete whispered. Silas waited. "Old Jenkins says he saw a woman near town the night of the robbery." Silas's stomach sank. "Jenkins says it was the girl staying with you." Jenkins was nearly blind. He mistook people all the time, but fear did not care about truth, and Willow Creek was already afraid. Silas rode home fast that evening. Dust rose behind him across the empty land. When he stepped into the cabin, he found supper waiting on the table. Beans, cornbread, a single candle glowing in the center. Faith looked up from the stove and gave him a small smile. "You looked troubled this morning," she said gently. "Thought a proper meal might help." Silas sat down and ate in silence. He watched her carefully, her calm hands, her quiet kindness, her tired but honest eyes. But doubt was a small splinter in the back of his mind. Did he trust her because she deserved it, or because he needed someone to trust again? Later that night, he stepped onto the porch. Faith stood near the railing, looking out across the dark valley. The last light of sunset glowed faintly along the horizon. She looked small against the wide land. Silas had never once seen her cry since the day he found her on the road. But that night, she did. Her shoulders shook quietly in the darkness where she believed no one could see. Silas stayed in the shadows. And in that moment he knew one thing with certainty. He believed her. But belief alone would not protect her. Because Willow Creek had already made up its mind. And the sheriff was coming. The morning sun had barely risen over the Montana hills when Silas heard the sound of hooves coming up the dirt road. They were slow and steady, the kind of sound that meant business. Silas stepped onto the porch just as Sheriff Harlan rode into the yard. His gray horse snorted softly as it stopped near the gate. The sheriff climbed down and dusted off his coat before looking toward the cabin. Faith appeared in the doorway behind Silas, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. She had been baking again that morning. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen behind her. Sheriff Harlan gave her a short nod. "Ma'am." Then he turned his eyes to Silas. "Mind if I ask her a few questions?" Silas stepped down from the porch slowly. Without thinking, he moved half a step closer to Faith. "Ask." The three of them stood in the yard, while the wind moved softly through the grass. The sheriff pulled a small notebook from his vest and tapped his pencil against the page. "When did you arrive in Willow Creek?" he asked. Faith answered calmly. 5 weeks ago. September 16th. Where from? Cincinnati. I worked at the Morrison textile mill. The sheriff scribbled something down. Then he looked up again. Anyone who can confirm where you were the night before the bank robbery? Faith's jaw tightened. I was here in this cabin. Sheriff Harlan slowly turned his eyes to Silas. You confirm that? Silas did not hesitate. She didn't leave. The sheriff wrote another note before closing the small book and slipping it back into his vest. I haven't decided anything yet, he said. His voice carried a warning beneath the calm words. But don't leave the county. Then he leaned closer to Silas and lowered his voice. If I were you, he said quietly, I'd sleep with one eye open. The sheriff mounted his horse again and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust drifting behind him. Faith stood very still in the yard. Her face had gone pale. That night, Silas woke to the quiet sound of fabric moving across the wooden floor. He stepped into the front room and found Faith kneeling beside her open valise. Clothes lay scattered around her while she quickly folded them and stuffed them back inside. What are you doing? Silas asked. Faith froze. Then she spoke softly. I have to leave. Silas frowned. You heard the sheriff, she said. The town already believes I robbed the bank. If I stay here, they will drag you into it too. They will take your land. Her voice grew quieter. I won't ruin your life the way that man ruined mine. Silas walked to the table and pulled out a chair. Sit down. Faith looked confused. What? Sit, he repeated. She slowly obeyed. Silas poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her. The clock on the wall showed 3 in the morning. Faith stared into the dark liquid. Well, my mother used to say everything happens for a reason, she whispered. I believed that even after she died. Her hands rested flat on the table. But there is no reason for this. Silas listened quietly. A man lies, she said. A woman walks 40 miles chasing a promise that never existed. A town decides she must be guilty because someone has to be. Silas leaned back in his chair. I buried my parents when I was 14, he said. Faith lifted her eyes. My brother sold the family land and left me with nothing but this old cabin. One winter nearly killed me out here. He looked around the quiet room. I stopped trusting people after that. Faith watched him carefully. Except you, he finished. Silence filled the cabin for a long moment. You still believe things happen for a reason, Silas said. If Faith did not answer. Maybe this is the reason, he continued. Maybe you came here because someone needed reminding that not everyone leaves. He stood slowly. You stay or you go, he said. That's your choice. Then he walked toward his room. But don't leave thinking you're saving me. Behind him, he heard Faith take a shaking breath. A moment later, he heard her footsteps moving toward the spare room. The door closed quietly. She stayed. 2 long weeks passed. Faith continued her work around the cabin, just as she always had. She cooked meals, cleaned the rooms, and tended the flowers that now grew bright along the porch rail. But the light inside her had dimmed. The quiet sadness in her eyes had returned. Then, one morning, Sheriff Harlan came back. This time, his face looked different. He removed his hat as he stepped toward the porch. Ma'am, he said. Faith paused on the steps. We caught the men who robbed the bank. Faith froze. 4 of them hiding near Ridgewater, the sheriff continued. They confessed to the Willow Creek robbery. Silas felt something loosen deep inside his chest. There was no woman with them, the sheriff added. Old Jenkins was mistaken. The person he saw had yellow hair. Faith's hair was dark brown. The sheriff lowered his eyes. Miss Faith, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. Faith remained still for a moment. Then she spoke. "Thank you for telling me." That was all. But the calm strength in her voice carried months of quiet pain. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek. A few days later, Martha Perkins arrived at the cabin with a fresh apple pie held awkwardly in both hands. "Made it this morning," she said, without meeting Faith's eyes. Faith accepted it politely. "Thank you, Martha." The town preacher came next, offering a kind invitation to return to Sunday service. Faith said she would think about it. Even old Jenkins sent a letter. His handwriting was crooked and shaky. The note held only a short apology for speaking when he had not truly seen what he thought he saw. Faith read it once. Then she folded it carefully and placed it inside the small chest beside her bed. "I'm not ready to forgive him," she told Silas quietly. "But I'm not ready to burn it either." Spring slowly warmed the valley. The flowers Faith had planted bloomed bright beside the porch. Purple and gold blossoms pushed through the stubborn Montana soil. The cabin changed too. Clean windows let sunlight fill the rooms. New curtains hung near the door. The old place no longer looked lonely. It looked lived in. One evening, Faith stepped onto the porch where Silas sat watching the sunset. She dried her hands on a cloth and sat beside him on the wooden bench. Their shoulders touched lightly. "I used to wonder why that man lied to me," she said quietly. Silas waited. Why he wrote those letters. The valley stretched wide and golden before them. "But I don't wonder anymore." She turned toward him. "If he had kept his promise, I would never have come here." Silas swallowed slowly. "Reckon not." Faith smiled gently. "I think I got the better end of the bargain." Later that night, she opened her valise one final time. Inside, she placed 3 things. The handkerchief Silas had given her, a dried marigold from the flowers she planted, and a folded piece of paper with one word written neatly across it. Home. She closed the valise and set it quietly aside. That evening, they sat together on the porch beneath a sky full of stars. After a long silence, Faith spoke again. "Why did you stop that day?" she asked softly. Silas thought for a moment. "Don't know," he said. "Just did." Faith leaned her head gently against his shoulder. "My mother used to say that sometimes the right people arrive exactly when we need them most," she whispered. Silas did not answer. Instead, he reached for her hand resting on the bench, and their fingers slipped together easily. The cabin behind them glowed with warm lamplight. The valley stretched wide beneath the quiet stars. 2 people who had once been left behind by the world now sat together in peaceful silence. No longer alone. No longer walking separate roads. They had finally found something worth holding on to.